What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we'll be modeling an explosive device, so let's just get started. Alright, so to start it off I'm going to select the cube and then start blocking out my main shapes. So I'm going to start off with the phone just because it's one of the larger objects in the scene, and just start scaling this cube to get the rough size and proportions that I'm looking for. And like always, it's important to not rush this phase and take your time while blocking out everything. Alright, so the main shape is there. I can now select those front faces and just extrude them so I can scale those nice and small to give me that top notch that's on the top of the phone. Now later on I end up just deleting some of these faces just to clean up the topology, but just for the time being I'm not worrying too much about how clean the model is. I just want to roughly get all the main shapes in place. So next up is grabbing a cube and then start blocking out all the buttons for the phone, as well as that chip card that's going to sit right above the buttons. I find it's just a lot easier finding the proportions and the scale of everything once a few of the objects are in scene, so I'm not worrying too much about the details and stuff at this point. I'm just trying to get the sizes to look correct. Alright, so the phone's looking good. Next up is the grenade. So I'm going to go ahead and select the cylinder and then start blocking that out. Alright, so now that all the main objects are in scene, I can start working on all the smaller things. So I'm going to start off with the USB port that's plugged into the side of the phone, and then I can work my way onto the battery and all the other small objects. So starting off with the cube, I'm going to start blocking out that USB. So these faces aren't lined up perfectly, and to be honest with you, I'm not too worried. I could have spent a little bit more time making sure that these lines were straight before extruding them, but since it's so small in the model and you're not going to be able to notice, I'm just going to extrude them inwards and then move on to the battery. So next up was creating some wires. Now I'm going to do that with the Sweep Mesh tool that's under the Create tab. So using the EP Curve tool, I can just create a curve and get that into the shape that I was looking for. And then once I'm happy with that, under the Create tab, I can go with that new Sweep Mesh tool, which is super handy. I can turn that curve into a nice wire, and I can just scale that nice and thin depending on how thick I want that wire to be. But just a really quick and easy way to create wires in my scene. So next up is creating a hole in the top of my phone. This is where the headphone jack would be. I'm going to have some wires coming out that end up being hooked into the grenade. So to do that, I'm going to create an 8-sided cylinder. The lower polys the better when creating booleans. And I can go ahead and boolean out a hole. And then once that hole is there, I can go with target weld tool and start connecting some of those verts. So next up is creating the wires that come out of the top of the phone that go into the grenade. So just like we did the USB, I'm going to go create another EP curve tool, and then I can just get that line into the shape that I was looking for, and then using that Sweep Mesh, I can create that nice thin wire. So next up is creating all the other wires in the scenes. So I'm going to go ahead and, just to save time, duplicate over some of my curves that I already created. That way I can just go edit those verts to get them into the position I was looking for, and then using that exact same sweep mesh tool, I can turn that curve into a nice thin wire. So I'm going to go ahead and start just copying and pasting those curves all over the model just to create all my other wires. Alright, so things are coming together. Next up is moving on to the bolts and the nails that are taped onto the side of the grenade. So to do that, I'm going to start off with a cylinder and then start blocking out those shapes. I want some of these nails to look a little bit different than the others, so I'm going to go add a few edge loops just so I can basically grab those verts and bend them over to look like the nails bent. I just don't want all the nails and screws looking identical, so adding a little bit of difference between the models will just make it look a little more interesting. Also, I'm not working with any dimensions when it comes to this model, so when it comes to proportions, I don't really know. For example, these nails and screws right now are like a thumbtack size, so I end up scaling these up quite a bit. And I find as you add models or different shapes to the scene, it tends to get a little bit easier finding the proportions of things. So I try not to get too stuck on finding the perfect size of each model as I create it, because I can always come back to it as I go on later on throughout the modeling process just to adjust things and make them look a little bit more proportionally accurate to one another. Okay, so now that majority of the nails and bolts are in place, I can start blocking out that duct tape that's wrapped around keeping these objects together. So to do that, I'm going to start off with a plane and just bring down those subdivisions so they're relatively low, and then I can start blocking out those shapes. now that the tape is all blocked out, I can go ahead and start beveling some of those sharp edges. Now I don't want to spend too much time perfecting the tape until all the other objects are basically finalized and seen, and then afterwards I can come back to the tape and just refine those verts to fit nice and snug against all those other objects. So just for the time being, I'm going to add some small bevels and then I can come back to it later on. So now that the tape is in position, I can go ahead and start tweaking some of my other shapes to fit a little bit better. Alright, so things are coming together. Next up is just working on all those objects that are on that front chip card. So starting off with a cylinder, I can start blocking out those main shapes. Alright, so now fast forwarding a bit, here's a completed model. I went ahead and just beveled some of those edges off of camera, just all those objects we added to that front chip card, and added a few more wires, but that's basically everything. So I ended up doing 2 different texture maps for this guy. The first one just consisted of the phone and all those objects on that chip card, as well as a few wires. And the second texture was everything else in the scene, so the nails, the bolts, the grenade, and the batteries. And like I said, I did adjust a few of those models off of camera, just beveled the edges and cleaned things up a little bit, but that's basically everything for the modeling. So now let's jump to Substance so we can start texturing. Alright, so now in Substance Painter, I can load in my FBX from Maya. And things are looking good, so I can switch over to my texture set settings, scroll down to Base Mesh Maps, and then choose your output size. I chose 4K, and then make sure you check that box that says use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, and then you can bake out your texture maps. Alright, so starting off with texture 1, I'm going to start off with the phone model, and I'm going to choose a smart material. I chose one of the plastic used materials, and then I'm just going to go tweak some of those settings and apply it to my phone. Now I'm not going to spend too much time getting the perfect texture that I want now. I find it's a lot easier when other textures are applied to other models. You can go later on to tweak some of those settings. I find it's just easier to get that texture you're looking for when other textures are also in the scene. It's really hard to dial in that perfect texture off the start, so I try not to waste a lot of time at the beginning, and then I can always come back to it later. So once I find a color I'm happy with, I can right click, set it to a black mask, and then assign it to that mesh. So next up was finding a material for the screen. I wanted the screen to be a little more reflective than the actual plastic border on the phone. So while choosing another smart material and applying it to this mesh, I ended up liking this material a little bit better than that first one we chose. So I ended up deleting that first texture and then applying this new one to my phone. So next up was finding that screen texture. So I ended up just looking through those smart materials, and I found some classic glossy texture that looked pretty cool with some scratches. So I ended up just opening that, tweaking a few of those settings, and then assigning it to that front face of my model. Now because that whole front face is one piece of geometry, that texture will also be applied to those numbers on the bottom. So all I have to do is just remove it from those faces that are on the bottom part of that model. So it's just applied to that top screen. So for the back of the phone, I didn't actually know what I wanted to do. I tried just reapplying one of the textures I already had and just changing some of the settings just to make it a little bit less scuffed up, but it was looking weird. So I ended up just jumping back into the materials, and I found something that's a little more accurate to what I had in mind. There was this plastic hexagon material that actually comes with Substance Painter, and it looked good off the start. Obviously your UVs are going to be dependent on textures like this, because if it's not straight, they're going to be a little bit off, and if you actually look very closely, you can tell that some of my rows are slightly off, so my UVs could be a little bit better, but it looked good enough. So all I had to do was change that color to a black, and then I could apply it to that back mesh on my phone. And because it was looking very clean, I just wanted it to look a little more realistic, so I just added a different plastic material over top of that hexagon texture, and then I could go in with the dirt brush and just paint on those edges just to make it look like it was worn out a little bit, like that rubber piece on the back of the phone, just after holding it for so long, it just kind of wears it out on the edges. And I just find adding these slight little wear and tear effects will make your models look a little more realistic. Now choosing another plastic glossy material, I can go start adding some numbers to my screen. So I wanted these numbers on my screen to glow a tiny bit, so to do that I just have to go to my shader settings in the top right corner and then switch my shader from metal rough to alpha blending, and that way I can go add an emissive channel to my texture, and then I can make these colors glow a tiny bit. Now because I'm using the Substance built-in fonts, you're very limited to your options, and this font I chose, the colons looked very weird. They were just like a line on the top. I don't know, it looked a little strange to me, so I decided to change that. So just doing the exact same process, I can add a different font and then just erase those tiny little lines and add the proper colon I added mine. So next up was finding some icons or symbols for my cell phone screen. So a quick and easy way to do that was just hopping on Google and finding an image of a cell phone screen I was happy with. Then I could save that image, just drag that right into my Substance project and apply that as a texture into the current session. That way I can then go to the projection tool and just project that image right onto my mesh. That way it looks like those symbols actually belong in the corners of my cell phone screen. And all I have to do afterwards is just change a few of those blending modes just to make it look like it actually belongs to that material. So next up was actually doing the screen itself for my cell phone. So to do that, I just found a different material and I just chose a square alpha that's in Substance Painter, just so I can basically paste on that square image right onto my mesh. And then I can just change the specularities to make it look like it's more like a screen, very specular and a little bit more clean looking. Now, an easier and probably cleaner way of doing this would be just prepping this during the modeling stages. I would just add a few edge loops where I wanted the screen to go, and then I could just fill in that square with whatever material I wanted. Because I didn't do that, I actually have to go and find this alpha and paste it on. And by doing it like this, you know, the lines could be a little bit off and not look as centered and as perfect as it can be. So if I were to redo this model, I would definitely make this screen part of the geometry or just have some edge loops just to make my life a little bit easier. But this way works as well. I just have to go in afterwards and make sure that that box is nice and centered. So next up was doing my chip card. Now this was much easier than I thought it was going to be. On the Substance Source website, they have tons of materials that you can download and add to your Substance library, and that's exactly what I did for this one. So they have a really cool chip card material. I just hopped on there, downloaded that, and then added it to this project. I could then find that in Substance, apply that to this mesh, and then go in and tweak a few of the settings to get that look I was looking for, but it definitely made my life so much easier when it came to this texture. So now that the chip card's looking good, it's time to apply some textures to my wires. So to do that, I'm going to hop into my Smart Materials, find some cool rubber tire texture, and then start applying that to all my wires. And then along with all the other little objects on this chip card, I'm going to go start applying different textures to all these different objects. So now that the chip card is looking relatively complete, I can move on to the buttons. So to do all the letters and the numbers, I'm just going to go apply different plastic material, just like I did all the other ones. I'm going to go find an alpha that's actually in Substance already to make my life a little bit easier, and then I can just paste those right onto those meshes. So now that these are all in place, it's time to go change the color to something closer to what I had in mind. Now these numbers and letters are looking a little bit too clean for me, especially because everything else is a little bit worn out on this model. So I could have just chose the eraser tool and chose like a dirt brush and just started erasing some of these numbers to make it look a little bit worn out. But another way of doing it was going to the textures and applying a certain grunge map to the roughness channel or the metallic. Whichever one looks better, you can mess around with those, but that's exactly what I did here. I just went to the textures and found some certain grunge or dirt material that looked pretty cool, and then I could just apply that right to my roughness channel. So next up is just finishing off applying all the materials to my texture one. Alright, so texture 1 is all wrapped up. I can move on to texture 2. So I'm going to start off with the batteries. I did the exact same process as before. I just googled Duracell battery online or whatever battery you'd like. And then I just save that as an image and I can drag that directly into this project, assign it as a texture and to the current session. And then with the projection tool, I can project this image right onto my mesh. Now, I did a really lazy job with the UVs when it came to this battery. As you can see, nothing is straight and it makes my life much more difficult when I'm actually applying this material. So something to keep in mind when you're actually doing your UVs, just make sure things are straight. It can make your texturing process much easier down the road, especially when it comes to projecting images onto your meshes. And you can actually tell that some of these lines are a little bit crooked in those final renders. If you look really closely, the Duracell batteries definitely aren't as clean as they could be, and what I should have done is just hop back in Substance Painter and fix the UVs on this battery and then come back to texturing. But just to save time on this model, I didn't do that, and I just had to kind of rotate the image around to make it work. So it is what it is. If I could go back and redo it, I would have, but it's a little bit too late now, and just something to keep in mind if you're going to recreate this model. So next up was moving on to that duct tape texture. So I quickly looked in my Substance library for a tape texture and I couldn't find anything, so I just quickly jumped back into Substance Source. They have a really awesome duct tape texture available that you can download, and that's exactly what I did. Just downloaded it, dragged it right into my Substance project and assigned that as a base material, and then I could just apply that right to that mesh in my project. So next was just wrapping up the remaining materials on this texture, so I'm going to spend the next little bit just finding some materials in Substance Painter and applying those to those meshes. Alright, so things are looking good, just those batteries are looking a little bit too clean compared to everything else on this model. So all I'm going to do is find a plastic material, change the color to something dark, and just change the brush to a dirt brush. And I can start just painting on this texture right over top of those batteries to make them look a little bit more worn out and a little bit more dirty. Alright, so now that majority of the texturing is done, I can jump into the render to see how things are looking and then quickly jump back to make some small adjustments. So at this point in the texturing process, I tend to jump in and out of the renderer and the editor quite often, just making those slight adjustments. When the model's put into a lit scene and how it's interacting with the environment, those materials always tend to need a few adjustments. And one of the things I actually noticed while jumping back and forth was the duct tape, and I realized those wrinkles, rather than being vertically, they should be horizontal, because as you pull that tape around, you would probably see those wrinkles being pulled horizontally. So I quickly jump back and make those small adjustments to the model. And that's basically it, folks. That's the whole modeling and texturing process that I did to create this explosive device. I ended up just spending a little bit of time tweaking a few of the settings and changing a few of the colors, but that's basically everything. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.